if you only read one chapter of scientific advertising, this one may be the most important, and if it isn't, then the next one is. So if you only read two chapters, they're the most important ones. And the reason they're the most important ones is simple. It is because people do not do the things they advocate. In this chapter, what Claude is talking about is the lessons you learn from mail order advertising, where you have to measure everything. Most people don't measure anything, and there's an old saying that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. I've made a few notes. A nice little quote from him: mail order advertising is traced down to a fraction of a penny. The cost per reply and cost per dollar per sale show up with utter exactness. Now, I never understood why Claude Hopkins was so important until I went into mail order myself and had to risk my own money. If you apply the same sort of discipline to your business, it will make a huge difference. Hopkins talks about coupons. Nowadays you might be talking about responses, you might be talking about people clicking through, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But most important, what he's really talking about relates to the great sin in business, which is that people see marketing as a cost, not as an investment. The minute you see it as an investment, the minute you think, I'm investing some money, I want to get some money back, you start measuring everything. What's very important is, when I say everything, I mean everything. Because, for instance, if you simply know that somebody opened an email, that's of no real value to you. If you saw they clicked through to see what the email was all about, well, that's a little bit of value. If you see that they actually did something as a result of clicking through, that's even more valuable. But if you actually got them to buy, now you're beginning to measure things that matter. But then you want to know a whole lot more. You want to know, did they buy again? How much did they spend? How long did they stay with you as a customer? All these things are very, very important, and they're all foreshadowed in this one chapter about the importance of measurement. The problem is, you see, that people follow fashion. They think, oh, let's put a lot of money into social media. Let's do this, let's do that. They don't do things based on measurement. That's what you've got to remember. Measure everything. Now, let me make one or two comments about this, starting with the fact that by measuring something, we were able to save one client £60,000 over a period of 3 months, a year or so ago, just by measuring and seeing what happened. Here are the things that I think you ought to be thinking about as you measure things. Number one, you ought to ask yourself, are you actually going for sales, or are you going for something vague like prestige or awareness? Sales are the only real measurement. So don't gamble. This is what Claude objects to in advertising. He said people gamble instead of going on a scientific basis. Remember that whilst what he talks about may be different to you, to your business, you may not immediately see the relevance. Look at your business carefully and ask yourself, what can you measure? What do you need to measure? Next thing, don't be guided by fashion, and don't be guided by what other people's results are. Your business is unique in that sense. Something that applies to somebody even in the same business as you may not apply to you. Measure everything. Measure everything. And the last point, the sixth point I'd like to make is, for God's sake, do something as a result of what you've measured. I've got a little PS here. For some reason, people imagine that things are different if you sell a service or if you sell something that's very, very expensive, that has a long sales cycle. It's not. I've sold stuff that's costing millions, and I've sold stuff costing pennies. The same principles apply, and they apply whether you're online or offline. Measure it. What are you getting for your money? How can you find ways of getting something better for your money? And I'm going to talk about that in the next chapter. I said when I was talking about the last chapter that this was also very important. David Ogilvy suggested it was the most important chapter in the book. I don't actually agree, because unless you start by measuring things, you're nowhere. But the thing to understand when you're looking at your creative work, whatever it may be, is that all you are doing is a substitute for salesmanship, which is why this chapter is called Just Salesmanship. In fact, if you could afford to, you would send your best possible salesman, if you have salespeople, round to every single prospect. Nothing could be more powerful than one person talking to another person, but you can't afford that. So you're using other media to do your selling for you, or your persuasion for you. Therefore, you must avoid perhaps the greatest sin in evaluating what you're sending out, and that sin is to look at it and think you like it and assume that therefore it must be good. Because people do not base their buying decisions on whether they think you're entertaining or clever or ingenious. They base their buying decisions on whether you have sold to them effectively, and that very rarely involves being entertaining. You should really be looking and asking yourself, if I were a salesman, is that what I would say? And there are other things that go on from that, but just to reinforce what I've just said, you have a huge problem if you work in marketing, because I can't think of any group of people offhand who are less like their customers than most of the people in marketing who sit in meetings talking rubbish about strategy. Yeah? Whereas their customers sit around thinking, can we afford to buy this? You couldn't get any group of people anywhere less like the customer than most of the people who are selling to them. It's a real problem. One of the things that comes up time and time again, I'm going to get it out of the way here, is length. Claude talks about it, he says, you don't need to be brief. You need to say as much as you think you need to say to cover off every reason why somebody should buy whatever or take whatever action you're asking them to take, and cover off every objection they may have to making that decision. Now, when we talk about length of copy, we tend to think in a rather shallow fashion. We say it's got to be a very, very long letter or a very, very long email. No, you've got to think of the whole communication properly. For instance, you can have a very short email and a very, very long landing page, which is a page where people can't stray from. So your email sends them to the long, long explanation. Don't worry about whether it's too long or not. Worry about whether it's interesting. There is nothing that says they have to keep reading or watching if you're using a video. Yeah? They can stop whenever they want to. Yeah? It's just you have to make sure that you keep going until they either buy or give up. Yeah? Very, very simple. Very, very important. All this, again, is based upon the principle of salesmanship. You would never send a salesman into somebody's home and say, go in there, come out with 3 witty words and leave. You would say, go in there and don't bloody well leave until you've got a sale or they've thrown you out. That's the essential principle. Yeah? Just salesmanship. Let me have a look at 1 or 2 comments I thought were interesting. David Ogilvy said something I've never forgotten about length. He said, I believe that if the copy is long, people think the subject is important. And I thought that was a very perceptive remark. Claude Hopkins put it very, very well in the chapter when he said, instead of seeking sales, they seek applause. I would say 9 times out of 10, if I look at it and I think it's wonderful, it's probably going to flop. Yeah? Because I'm pleased. We're pleased. We've created something. We're pleased with what we've created, but they're not interested in what we've created. They're just saying to themselves, well, the old rhyme I often use is tell me quick and tell me true what your product's going to do, or else my love to hell with you. So you've got to get straight to the point, tell them what's in it for them, and then explain why they should do what you want them to do. And at the end of each chapter, I'm making a few points for you to remember. So here are some points to remember. Number 1, look at it, read it, study it, watch it, whatever the medium may be. Has it been created to interest you or the buyer? Many people make this mistake. Beware if you think it's wonderful. This is so obvious, I almost apologise. Show it to a likely customer. If you can find somebody who's a likely customer, show it to them. If you don't know any likely customers, then I suggest you make it your business to find some. Because you won't learn anything by talking to people amongst your colleagues. You'll find out about things by talking to possible customers. Talk to your salespeople if you've got them, or anybody who has to deal with customers. Go on sales calls with them if you have sales calls. When I handled the American Express account around the world, the one thing that struck me about their people that made them better than their competitors was that their senior people would sit in and listen in on phone calls. I recommend that. Read customer emails or letters. Try the most difficult thing on earth. Try selling the damn thing yourself. That's how you really understand what's going on in your customers' minds. Okay, so it's just salesmanship. I think this chapter, chapter 3, can be easily misleading because when he talks about offer service, which makes sense, he starts by more or less saying you shouldn't sell. And this is nonsense, and I don't think it's really what he meant. What he meant, I think, is that you're better off being helpful in the first place than selling. And again, I've mentioned online a lot, but if you look at what's going on online, you will see that the technique that is generally used is precisely what Claude was advocating 90 years ago. Offer something helpful, offer something free. So you usually see online people offering you a free seminar or a free booklet that you can download, a free white paper, whatever it may be. It's much better than simply saying, buy my stuff. He's saying there are easier ways to get into people than outright salesmanship. So offering incentives, and I was entertained when I read this chapter originally, because he talks about the maker of an electric sewing machine finding advertising difficult. So he offered to send it to any home absolutely free so that people could try it. And believe it or not, when I had my first job as a creative director in 1964, I had a client who sold washing machines, and I hadn't actually read this book then, but I did offer a free 1 week trial of the washing machine. And we found that 80% of the people who tried it bought, as opposed to the 50% or 40% who were buying previously. So we offered service. I did it right without knowing why I was doing it right. Let me just turn to my notes for a moment. One of the things you should think about is that, generally speaking, the better the incentive, the better you'll do. An old friend of mine, one of the pioneers of direct marketing in the UK, once said, be as generous with your incentives as you can. So offer as much as you can. Don't just do that. Test your incentives. See what will work. We talked about testing already. And sell your incentive. In other words, don't just say, here's a free so-and-so or get this free so-and-so. Do a real selling job on it. Explain why people should accept it. Because if you just say it's free, people think, well, if it's free, it's worth nothing. But when you've sold it, when you've thought, if I had to take money off somebody for this incentive, would they buy it? That's the way to think about it. So you've got to sort of turn your thinking around a little bit, because it's natural for you to think it's free, it's not worth very much. Think carefully about the ways in which you could go about incentives, and think carefully about the kinds of incentives you should offer. And I'm going to talk, when I discuss the next chapter, about the things that matter most in marketing, of which incentives is one. But let's think about what the things are that you might offer people. Would you offer them a free advice? Would you offer them, these are the things you've got to think about. It's hints for you to think about things, yeah? Would you offer them free advice? Would you offer them a booklet? Would you offer them a free seminar? Would you offer them a free trial? Think a hell of a lot about the things that you can offer people as an incentive. And here's one thing you can give consideration to. Think about something you already sell that you could offer free. There you are. Spend a lot of time thinking about incentives because they are, as Claude puts it, offering service. The opening of this chapter has a phrase in it which I've always loved. He talks about the fact that in mail order, false theories melt away like snowflakes in the sun. So he's really, once again, saying you should test everything. And he talks about pictures and says, you know, they tested everything. They've made comparative tests. I found that many things that surprised me came about as a result of thinking about things I might test. Years ago, I used to do the advertising for the British Horse Racing Board, and I found that a moving picture worked very well. And so what I had was a racehorse galloping across the top of the screen, dragging behind it a little message that said you could be the part owner of a racehorse for £75. There are lots of other things that you can test to see whether they work or not. You can try adding a word to something. We found that adding the two words how to at the beginning of a subject line doubled response. Increased response by 50%. You can try a strange word. The word weird, for instance, for some reason seems to attract more response. For one of my clients who sells car hire in Europe, I kept on using the word crazy, and we found that if we didn't use the word crazy, response went down. Try using emotional words. There's lots of emotional words you can use. You've got to study copywriting to understand what they are. Sometimes you can use a picture. I was in Paddington Station a while ago, and I saw a hawk on a letterbox. God knows what the hawk was doing there. And I used it to promote something I was beginning to sell, which was called my Young Birds Creative Service. The Young Birds Creative Service, which was a new business, was entirely produced by trying something, by testing something I thought might work. And funnily enough, Al, who is with me here now, didn't think it would work, and he's usually right. It's one of the rare occasions when he's been wrong, but it actually created a whole new business. Imagine you wake up in the morning and you think, oh, I've just had an idea, let's try it, and by lunchtime you've got a new business. Do you realise that, yeah? I suddenly thought, young birds, and I thought of it in the morning, and we sent out an email just after lunch, and by the evening I thought, I've got a new business here. Not a big business, but a business that, I don't know, will bring in quite a few £1,000s every month, and actually could be the basis for a whole new business. So all that through thinking about things I could test, yeah? So what you've got to do is think about things you could test. And I'm just looking here about what you might test, yeah? You must look at the ways in which people go about doing what they do. I mean, you must not think about testing things that seem obvious to you. What you tend to test very often is creative work. Number one, things to remember, creative work is not the only thing to test. In your business, the things that are going to matter most, will make the biggest difference to your business are, number one, changing what you offer. Number two, changing the positioning of what you offer. In other words, the character of what you offer, the character of your company, becoming more friendly, for instance. The next thing that's going to make the most difference is targeting. The dullest message sent to the right person will do better than the most brilliant message sent to the wrong person, and targeting includes timing. I once took a business that was losing money in 1967 and made it a money-making business simply by changing the times at which I made the offer. They were making the offer after 6 weeks. I started making the offer immediately, and then I changed the product slightly, but that's another point. So you've got to test the right things, and it's not just creative. The golden rule in testing, by the way, is only test things that are, pardon me, I'm very old, significantly different. Things that matter. They may not be huge things. For instance, testing something that flashes on a website can increase response. We tested a little arrow that pointed to something not long ago, and sales went up 14%. So they don't have to be huge things, but they have to be things that are perceptibly different. And the other important thing is, when you're testing, you should either test one thing or test everything. If you test 2 things, you never know what made the difference. If you test everything, you know that testing everything made a difference. If you test one thing, you know that one thing made the difference. So that's some advice about testing. I think I may have misled you. I've rather given the impression that the only 2 chapters that matter are the first 2 chapters and maybe the third. But I've rereading this book for God, I don't know how many times I've read it. Rereading it, I discovered that in many of the other chapters, and particularly this one, there are lots of little ideas that you look at and you say, oh, I should try that now. Here we are, 90 years later, you should try it now. The point he makes in this chapter, of course, is that the headline is the most important element in an advertisement. In much the same way, you can apply to any communication the fact that the beginning is what matters most, yeah? And Claude, at the beginning of the chapter, points out that it's very difficult to ignore a salesman. And if you're thinking about media, you can almost exactly relate the cost of media to the degree to which it's hard to ignore them. I'll give you an example. Okay, if I'm sitting in front of you physically, if we were in this room, it'd be very hard for me to ignore you. Sorry, it'd be very hard for you to ignore me. I would certainly not ignore you, because you're important. Next most effective medium may well be one person talking to a lot of people, yeah, as opposed to one-to-one. Next most important could be the telephone. It's very, the phone rings. It's very hard for you to ignore it, and so on, right down the road to the least noticeable thing, which I have to tell you is probably a tweet. If you use Twitter and you put a tweet up and you've got lots of followers you're involved with, go and have a look 5 minutes later and see where your tweet is. It's forgotten, it's gone. It's perhaps even less noticeable. You're driving along and you see a poster, whoosh, it's just gone, yeah? But so that he's talking about how you get attention. You get attention because of the nature of the medium. But after that, you get attention because of the way that you open the communication. What do? I gave you the example not long ago of the racehorse galloping across the screen. That movement was hard to ignore. Yeah? Things that flash are hard to ignore. But looking at things from a linear perspective, and starting at the beginning and going down, okay, in your email, the subject line, spend 10 times as much time thinking about the subject line as you do about anything else. If you're looking at your website, look at that page and think, what are people going to see? And people talk to you about above the fold and below the fold. Well, obviously they're going to look at the top before they look at the bottom. If you were to read one of my books, God bless you, you'll see that I talk about the way that people look at pages. Yeah, I can tell you that if a page is square, then people's eyes will flash down to just below the middle, and then they'll go up to the top left-hand corner, and then they'll go down to the right. And this applies whether you're talking about websites or anything else. The only thing that affects it is things that do things that attract the eye, pictures, flashing things, bright colours, and so on. All these are, I'm going beyond the subject of headlines, I'm going into something broader perhaps. I'm talking about how you get attention, because if you don't get attention, you can't start them, they ain't going to carry on. If they don't carry on, you can't sell them, can you? Yeah? So think most about how you begin. Just let me have a look at this, and he talks a little bit about what sorts of headlines work best. And let me tell you that the kind of headlines that work best are ones that give you news of a benefit. And there's a chapter that's coming up which talks about the best way in which you can give news of a benefit. And he points out that people do not read ads for amusement. And this goes back to the point I was making in the last chapter about the fact that not the last chapter, the chapter before that, don't try and run stuff that you think is wonderful. People don't want to be entertained. They want to know what's in it for them. And he talks about the way that he claims he keyed returns on nearly 2,000 headlines. Well, here's a suggestion for you. If you want to get some good headlines, go and buy one of two books. In fact, you should buy both of them. One is a book called How to Write a Good Advertisement by Vic Schwab, and that has a list of 100 headlines. And any of John Caples' books, again, gives you lots of good headlines. Search the world and steal the best. Yeah? Don't try to be original. Somebody was talking to me about this at a seminar once, and commenting on the fact that David Ogilvy had stolen something. And I simply replied that talent steals, genius improves. So your job is to be a genius. You've got to look for good headline ideas, look for good opening ideas, and be ever on the lookout for things. Be ever on the lookout. Be on the lookout for things that have got nothing to do with your business. I'm always looking for things, any idea anywhere that I can steal, yeah, and adapt. Very rarely does it pay to do it exactly the same. But so, how you begin is the most important thing. That's the point. First thing to remember: how you begin is the most important thing. Second thing to remember: spend more time on how you begin than on anything else. Spend at least 10 times as much on how you begin on anything else. Next point: study other people who've managed to attract attention. The way you can see whether they've done it is if they keep on running the same thing. And if they're counting their results, they're running it because it works.